Hello, my name is Arik Korman, Communications Director with the League of Education Voters. Welcome to our free online webinar series, Lunchtime LEVinars. We started these series over 4 years ago to share information and build knowledge on important and timely issues. Today we will hear from Daniel Zavala, Director of Policy and Government Relations at the League of Education Voters, on what you need to know about the McCleary School Funding Agreement. Daniel will speak for about 15 minutes, and we will have about 10 minutes for questions. The focus of today's webinar will be on what was in the Legislature's school funding solution, what it means for us, and what the next steps are. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. You'll notice a chat function on the right side of your screen. This is a space for you to pose questions to us. As always, feel free to send any feedback about the webinar quality to us at info@educationvoters.org. Daniel Zavala is a Washington native with family on both sides of the mountains. His path to policy work was shaped by his parents' backgrounds in education and social justice. His career started in the classroom as a bilingual special education teacher after finishing his bachelor's and master's degrees at Stanford University. As a teacher for students with special needs, he saw firsthand the intersection of law and policy in the classroom. After teaching, he earned his law degree at the University of Washington, focusing on education issues and working with education groups, and then the Washington State Attorney General's office in the Education Division. After law school, Daniel worked for Students First on state-level policy, and most recently served as the Deputy Director at Tennessee CAN. When not on campus in Olympia, I know, you probably don't like this part, Daniel spends his free time exploring the many natural wonders of the Evergreen State and training for Ironman triathlons. Please welcome Daniel Zavala.
Well, thank you, Eric. I think at some point I'm going to have to change my biography so it reads a little bit different. One thing that I'd like to do, and I realize we're a couple of weeks out from session right now, and so people have varying levels of understanding about what's happened, whether through the news, whether through friends, through other sources of information, that Lev has put out thus far. And so I wish, and remember when I was a teacher, it was so easy to check for understanding because you had a little exit slip and you can go and you can review each person's. And then I realized kind of by the time I got to college, you just had little clickers that kind of, this is where I am on the scale. And so with that, I have nothing, right? I think I'm looking into a camera and talking into a phone, and I think I will assume basic information, and for those who wish to go into kind of deeper questions, we can certainly do that toward the end. But really, kind of, we'll just jump right into it about kind of the high-level stuff that was in the agreement. So overall, there were really some significant advances that were made this year, but there's still plenty of work to be done. The one kind of thing I'll put on that is that you can really bisect this session into two different things, especially around the K-12 and really around the broader education funding and policy landscape. One section of it is really kind of the McCleary compliance. The other section of it is everything else that needs to be done in education. And so when we say significant advances, it really is this idea that we're not quite where we need to be in terms of the everything else, but are really around the McCleary and foreshadowing a little bit of what I will talk about. We seem to have made some significant progress, if not completion, or at least a plan for completion. And then, as I mentioned, there are really kind of strong increased investments in education, and that while the legislature did direct some additional funding to programs for historically underserved students, the needs and the opportunity gaps are really vast. And so we see promising directions, but again, foreshadowing, there's a lot of promising stuff, and a lot of it will hinge on the implementation. And then regarding the funding formula that was historically and continues, to be a key source of inequity, within districts, across the state, really, the staff mix formula, one component of that was eliminated. And so, what we're looking to see is some modernization with that funding formula that should direct greater amounts of funds based off of student need.
What is the staff mix formula? For someone who doesn't know.
Good question. Yeah, sorry, and I realize and Eric is helpful in helping me point those out. So the staff mix formula was a component of our funding formula that actually kind of created a disparity across districts because it would send money to districts based off of the type of staff that they had within the district and their experience that they had. So you had districts that had a lot of staff with a great number of years of experience receiving greater funds than districts that had lower experienced staff. And so what we actually saw was that districts that were wealthier tended to have more experienced staff and would continue to get additional funds, whereas lower performing districts or districts with lower property values didn't receive as much. And as I mentioned, auditing is really going to be key to ensuring that we don't go back to where we started, so looking at that implementation. And finally, one kind of big thing to put on here is that the agreement really does not address much in way of accountability. A big asterisk I'll put there is that with ESSA, which is the federal law around education, the Every Student Succeeds Act, our state is creating a consolidated plan that does include components of accountability there. So around K-12 funding, the enhancements will start in the 2018-19 years and will be fully implemented by 2019-20. So we see a 4-year phase-in. In total, the budget will be just around $22 billion, with actual spending this last biennia around 18.2. So you can see the increases there. And that these enhancements above this actually include about $2 billion in what's called maintenance and carry forward. And this includes the K-3 class size reduction that has been a part of the McCleary order. And then one number that has been put out a lot that I'll try and help dissect a little bit is $7.3 billion of additional state funding in K-12 over the next 4 years. What that $7.3 billion includes is the $2 billion in maintenance and carry forward, as well as $1.8 billion that will be put in 2017-19, and then $3.3 billion that will be put in from 2019 to 21. And I should note, about 75% of that $7.3 billion is attributable to staff salary increases. In terms of the funding formula, the prototypical school funding model is maintained. This was something that was really important in terms of stability and consistency for districts and stakeholders within the system. But the staff mix factor, as I mentioned before, has been eliminated.
Okay, what is the prototypical school model?
Great question. So the prototypical school model is our current way and our future way of funding schools. And what it actually does is just create kind of your archetype school. In an ideal school, an ideal middle school, you would need this many, classroom teachers, this many nurses, this many librarians. And so based off of that, funds are generated to help achieve those staffing levels. And so the categorical funding formulas, so what we consider categoricals include the Learning Assistance Program for academically struggling students. It includes the Transitional Bilingual Program for English learners, special education, highly capable for our advanced students. And so those formulas are actually maintained, and then career and technical education has become a part of those categoricals. But they will differ in terms of the amounts given per student based on the regional salary level paid. And so I'll get into that regional salary level, but just know that there will be some differentiation still within the system in terms of how money is being driven out. And one additional note here is that there will be some additional reporting requirements in per pupil amounts. And so one kind of common thread that had lasted throughout the session was, if we moved away from a prototypical school model, do we move to what some call a student-weighted model? And one of the main reasons for that is understanding what is the per pupil amount that we're actually, one, generating, but two, spending for students based off of student need, based off of regional area, grade level, etc. And so having the report in the per pupil amounts is kind of one step in that process to better understand school district budgets and expenditures. And then, so I-1351, for those that remember, was primarily a class size reduction initiative that was passed in the state. It came with, in order to fully kind of fund it and to meet the requirements of I-1351, came with a pretty significant additional increase in state funding. And so the state has really been struggling with how to kind of reconcile that with some of the other needs that have been addressed or identified within the system. And so it now kind of has a permanent stature, which is that it will be revisited at a later time. But through recommendations from OSPI, which is our state education agency, the Office of the Superintendent for Public Instruction, who will then kind of make recommendations for the various components of Initiative 1351. So I'm going to just go a little bit into revenue, mostly because this was not an area of expertise really within the education realm, but it is something that is critical to how schools are funded and how the state generates funds. So what has been changed is that the school district levy formula is now at a flat rate of $1.50 or the maximum amount of $2,500 per student. So that is different from the model before, which has kind of had a varying percentage with some grandfather districts and a levy cliff that many people frequently heard about. And so what's now kind of is a far more simplified $1.50 per $1,000 of assessed property value. And that local effort assistance, which is kind of what the state provides for districts that are not able to kind of raise that kind of revenue, which would amount to either $1.50, or sorry, which would be to the $2,500 per student, will actually have a minimum of $1,500 per student set. One thing to note real quick on that, though, is that I'm trying to simplify the explanation slightly, is that under the previous model, there were far greater outliers, and so you had people who were able to generate far more, or people who weren't able to generate as much in terms of the overall stated average. And so what's happened now is in having the simplified formula, we've gotten rid of those outliers, but we've actually created a larger delta or difference between the state average. So recognizing that the state average is going to be somewhere between $2,500 and $1,500, that $1,000 gap between the two is actually larger than the existing gap on average across the state. So one other thing that was eliminated into the policy changes from this legislative session is the statewide salary allocation model. And so what will occur now is that OSPI will create kind of a state template that districts may adopt, but districts have the free reign to develop and adopt their own salary allocation models. There will be some parameters around that, including a minimum teacher salary of $40,000 and a maximum teacher salary of $90,000, and that maximum actually has a couple of asterisks as well that include a three-tiered district-based regional cost of hiring system, which is a lot of words of basically saying that the state will now tier how it generates and distributes funds for teacher salaries based off of the property values within those districts. And so we'll see three different tiers at 6, 12, and 18%, based off of a couple of factors that include your neighboring districts, and so taking into account their property values, but then also the property values. And so the intention behind that is really to help districts have intra-district market competition so that they can compete in terms of getting, recruiting and retaining teachers with other jobs that are there in the local economy and not inter-district competition, which we saw quite a bit of before, and frankly still may see even under this system, which would be teachers moving from district to district based off of different incentives and bonuses that they may receive. We'll see 3 days of state-funded professional development for teachers. This is significant because while historically the state has provided this, in recent memory it has not. And so what we've seen now is the state actually saying that professional development is part of basic education and the state will fund a portion of what teachers need. And then in terms of some more limitations is that supplemental contracts, what was previously kind of referred to as tri-pay, are limited to enrichment activities outside of basic education. So we have a pretty clear definition of what basic education is, some may argue. But what is pretty clear now, at least, is that the tri-pay or those supplemental contracts are limited to enrichment activities and cannot be used for basic education.
So would that be something like coaching or teaching a zero-period band or something along those lines?
Yeah, absolutely. And then one other kind of thing to note is that health benefits, which were previously done by districts individually, are actually now moved to a statewide system that will be called the School Employees Benefits Board. In terms of student supports, as I mentioned before, there were increases in funding in what we call the categoricals. One big thing to note here is that there was a newly created high poverty concentration for LAP. I say that it's big to note for two reasons. One is that it generates additional funds for students that are in schools with a high concentration of poverty, but two, in that it's actually the first time our state has recognized that schools that have a high concentration of historically underserved student populations actually need additional money beyond just what those individual students generate. And so to put it more explicitly, right, is this idea of that, you know, if you actually have a high concentration of those students, you're going to have greater needs that come from that. And so this is the first time that we see the state really recognizing that additional need that comes with having a large concentration or congregation of similar of students with similar needs. And so that's important to note. And then other things to note is that there's continued funding for expanded learning opportunities, as well as some data systems that will help with early interventions and early warning. As I mentioned before, in accountability, there was not much in the way of the legislative pathway to address this, but we do see some new accounting and reporting requirements for districts, and also some expanded responsibility of the state auditor's office that come with those new requirements. So I'll pause there just so people can kind of digest that for a brief moment, and kind of tee up what the main kind of way that this session had been presented is that it's the McCleary session, right? That's what 2017 is all about, is to fulfill the state's requirement around the McCleary order that the Supreme Court has handed down back in 2012, but most recently in an order from 2016 in terms of what was left to do on the state's part. So the big question is, does it pass constitutional muster? Well, I am not one of the 9 justices who sits in the High Court with the robe, so I can't speculate as to whether or not it does. I will go over the timeline briefly as to when they will report on that, but one of the things that they noted in their most recent order from October of last year was that any program the legislature establishes must be fully and sufficiently funded from, and then I put the emphasis my own, regular and dependable state, not local revenue sources. And so one could argue that the funding plan and the policy changes they put in place are both regular and dependable because they have a revenue stream. In terms of the timeline as to when the court will actually kind of speak on this, July 30th, which is coming up just a few days from now, the state attorneys have to submit the report to the Supreme Court. And then in August, the plaintiffs from the McCleary case will actually have a chance to respond. And then in fall, we'll actually see a Supreme Court response. So we have the good, the bad, and the so kind of an overall review. So the good we see, and I think, go ahead and just do all 3 of them. So what we have to celebrate is increased money that goes towards education. We have additional targeted funding for specific student populations. And we have some new guardrails that go in place to ensure that the money that is being generated is going towards its intended target. In terms of the, go ahead and do it again, what we have to monitor, as I mentioned, right, we have these enrichment levy expenditures, so there's kind of some caps in terms of what the enrichment levies, that $1.50 I was talking about, can be used on for non-basic education purposes. It comes to the compliance and the implementation. So making sure that it's actually being used for its purpose so that we don't see the kind of variance or variation that we saw under the old model. Similarly, under staffing practices, school budgets, and frankly on the school level per pupil for categoricals, again, it's just monitoring and monitoring the implementation to make sure that while those practices look very promising, that the implementation follows suit. And then in terms of kind of what's left to do, that next, what we didn't get, what was left behind, there's really a lot of work to be done around accountability, so increased transparency, but also what we're doing to support our schools and districts that are really struggling to see significant changes in student outcomes. What we can do to increase access to supports, not only for students, but also for educators. And I say educators broadly because we had a lot of focus this session on our classroom teachers, but we want to see kind of even broader focus and deepened focus on not only our teachers, but our paraprofessionals and our administrators. That includes our school leaders, like our principals. And then further, we just want to see deeper community engagement in the entire process. And as I mentioned around the supports, with those supports, some additional resources that come in that way. And with that long and winded explanation, I will actually go ahead and give it to Arik to take questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Daniel. And we have about 10 minutes for questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please type your question in the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen. And no question is too basic. What I'd like to know, Daniel, is what kind of impact from the McCleary Agreement will we see on the local school level?
It's a great question. So a couple ways of answering that, right? And maybe even the easier way of asking is how will things look different?
Yep.
We have a 4-year phase-in, and we also have some and 4-year phase-in of just getting the policies implemented or enacted or started or whatever the word you might use. And even with that 4-year phase-in, you would even, you would even suggest that it may take longer to actually see those policies fully realized and having their impact. And so, I guess I'm dancing around the question, but part of the way I would answer it is that the way things should look different is that schools that have high concentrations of historically underserved students should see additional funds across the board. Not only with the high poverty concentration with the Learning Assistance Program, but also that across the board where they already have more special education students, more academically struggling students, more students who tend to be bilingual or English learners, that they will see additional funds for those students as well. And that, with the increased funding around career and technical education, we'd actually see increased access to those pathways that lead to something after high school. And then around educators, with additional state funds going toward salaries, we hope and expect to see that districts are able to use this as an opportunity to recruit and retain teachers, not only in our hard-to-staff subjects, but across the board and in all schools.
So do you see teachers getting a significant salary bump from this?
So that's another good question, right? So there are opportunities for teachers to get incentives in hard-to-staff areas, like special education. There is that new $40,000 minimum. So with that, we would expect to see that those teachers who are below that $40,000 minimum would have to get an increase. There's also a bump that goes into place for teachers that are in districts for at least 5 years. And so there's already kind of 3 mandatory increases, or at least opportunities around that. But really, it comes down to waiting and seeing what districts do with their new salary allocation models.
And what will it do for other educators, like principals or paraeducators who are also helping our kids?
Yeah, so that remains to be seen as well, right? Because the legislature didn't address, any sort of salary changes or additions on those fronts. So we'll have to wait and see.
Great. And how does this affect a property-rich district like Seattle or Bellevue?
So many districts, and those may be 2 examples, and there's certainly several other, if not hundreds of others, across the state that will see changes to their property taxes. And so several will increase, but with those increases, we are seeing significant increases in the amount of money the state is providing for education.
Do you see that it will equalize the student experience across the state?
I think that's part of the intention, right, is to actually create an equal playing field around funding. One thing in that, right, is that it's incredibly complex, and I think anybody who kind of delves into the system, and the further you delve, the more complex it becomes. And so the intention is there to level the playing field. I think, as I kind of alluded to in some of the examples, whether it's the regional salary pay, whether it's still basing some of the categorical programs on staffing salaries, that we'll still see variations across districts. And so I think one of the important, and in fact perhaps one of the most important things in all of this to ensure that we have a level playing field is having that transparency and understanding the school budgets and expenditures so that we can actually recognize where certain schools are perhaps receiving less than others, especially when they have students of similar style population.
Great. And in terms of the way that the money will be collected, it's going to be a gradual phase upward of the state property tax and a gradual decrease of the local levies. Is that how it's going to go, sort of dovetailing, I guess?
Yeah, so we don't exactly know where the local levies will end up because, again, that's up to the locals to determine what their levy rates will be. So those will fluctuate. But yeah, there will be, it won't be entirely abrupt all in one year. It will be phased in.
Great. Will any of the monies collected from local levies under the new system be allowed to be used for administrative payroll?
So that's a good question, and certainly, as I mentioned before, it's administrative payroll. It does not necessarily fall into the basic education definition, so it could be used for that.
Right. How do you think that the legislature will proceed going forward now that we've got this particular solution? Do you think they're going to just roll up their sleeves and say, okay, we're done, or do you think they're going to continue to push?
A lot of that is going to hinge on what the Supreme Court says in their response that we'll see in the late summer or fall of this year. And so, if what we get is a response and what we expected to see is a response that says that kind of the McCleary order, if all of this is fully implemented and phased in as described, with that McCleary order, if all of that is done, according to plan, then McCleary is satisfied, right? If that's the case, then as I mentioned before, right, even bisecting this session into the two things, even if we fulfilled McCleary, there are still several other things that need to be addressed, particularly around student supports.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so I don't see, and from us as advocates, the general public, but also the legislature sees that as well.
Okay, we have a question about the levy swap. If the state is basically assuming the property tax authority from local districts, what percentage of state-collected property tax dollars in the future will actually represent new funding for schools?
That's a great question. And I think because there's such wide variation based off of the district and what's being contributed and where it was going, we actually, and so there's two ways, right? One is just broadly across all education, how much new money of state is attributable to the local levies. We don't know, particularly because we don't know kind of where those local levies were really supplanting basic education services versus enrichment services. And really it's going to vary based off of the district, how much of those local levies are actually going to backfill. What we do know is that if you add up all of the amounts that local levies contributed to K-12 education, which is a little over $2 billion in this last biennium, the additional increase in state funding actually goes beyond that. So even, one of the things that people commonly refer to as like a levy swap, right? That all the state is doing is just taking the money generated from local property taxes and then just saying that that's new state funding. And so what we see is actually more state funding than was attributable to that. And so at least we know that there is more state funding going in than just a levy swap.
Great. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for a great presentation. I really appreciate it. Our next webinar will take place next month in August. The exact date is to be determined. The topic will be Washington State's plan for the Every Student Succeeds Act, what it means for local communities, and how we can get involved. Registration information will soon be at our website, educationvoters.org. Thanks to each of you for joining us today. If you have additional questions, please send them to info@educationvoters.org. A recording of today's presentation will be available on our website, educationvoters.org. Please feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. Thank you again for attending, and we hope you will join us at future webinars.